For wealth and status, he betrays his wife, never imagining his father-in-law was the Mafia boss. That single truth would reshape everything Daniel Morrison thought he understood about power, loyalty, and the quiet woman he had discarded like yesterday's newspaper. The rain fell in sheets over Manhattan that November evening, streaking down the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse apartment Daniel had worked so hard to obtain. He stood there, adjusting his silk tie, watching the city, lights blur through the water. Behind him, his wife Clara sat on the white leather sofa, her hands folded in her lap, her dark eyes fixed on nothing in particular. She had always been like that, quiet, unassuming, the kind of woman who blended into the background of any room, even her own living room. Daniel had married her 3 years ago, believing she came from modest means, a simple girl from a middle-class family in New Jersey. Her father, Thomas Benedetti, owned what Daniel assumed was a small chain of Italian restaurants. Nothing impressive, nothing that matched the ambition burning in Daniel's chest. What Daniel wanted was Victoria Ashworth. Victoria, with her blonde hair and designer clothes, her family's shipping empire, and their estate in the Hamptons. Victoria, who laughed at his jokes at charity galas and touched his arm when no one was watching. Victoria, who represented everything Daniel believed he deserved. Clara watched her husband check his phone for the 3rd time, in 5 minutes. She knew, of course she knew. Wives always know, even when they choose to say nothing. She had seen the late nights, the mysterious calls, the way he looked through her instead of at her. But Clara had learned patience from her father. She had learned that silence could be a weapon sharper than any blade. Daniel turned from the window and grabbed his coat from the rack near the door. He did not look at his wife when he spoke. "I have a business dinner tonight. Do not wait up." Clara nodded slowly. She had stopped asking questions months ago. What was the point? The answers were always lies wrapped in expensive cologne and rehearsed indifference. The door closed behind him, and Clara remained on the sofa, listening to the rain. In her pocket, her phone buzzed. A message from her father. She read it twice, then deleted it, as she always did. Some conversations were not meant to leave traces. Across town, in a brownstone that looked unremarkable from the outside, Thomas Benedetti sat in his study surrounded by books he had actually read and paintings he had personally selected from auctions in Rome and Florence. He was 63 years old, with silver hair combed back from a weathered face and eyes that had seen more than most men could imagine. To the world he was a successful restaurateur. To the people who mattered, he was something else entirely. Thomas held a glass of whiskey and stared at the photograph spread across his mahogany desk. His daughter, Clara on her wedding day, Daniel Morrison shaking hands with business associates, Daniel Morrison entering a hotel in Midtown, Daniel Morrison kissing a blonde woman in a parking garage. The man sitting across from Thomas was named Vincent. He had worked for the Benedetti family for 30 years, since he was barely old enough to drive. His loyalty was absolute. His discretion was legendary. "How long has this been going on?" Thomas asked, his voice calm as still water. Vincent shifted in his chair. 8 months confirmed, possibly longer. "The woman is Victoria Ashworth. Her family owns Ashworth Maritime. The father is looking to expand into Mediterranean routes and needs investors." Thomas nodded slowly, processing the information. "And my son-in-law, what does he hope to gain?" Vincent hesitated. "From what we have gathered, Morrison believes that divorcing Clara and marrying the Ashworth daughter will elevate his position significantly. He has been telling associates that his current marriage was a stepping stone, nothing more." The silence that followed was heavy. Thomas Benedetti had survived decades in a world where betrayal was common currency. He had buried friends and enemies alike. He had made decisions that kept him awake some nights, decisions he justified by the safety of his family. And now the man he had allowed into that family, the man who shared a bed with his only daughter, was treating her like a disposable asset. Thomas finished his whiskey and set the glass down with deliberate care. Does Clara know? She suspects, but she has not confronted him. Vincent paused. She is stronger than he realizes. Thomas almost smiled. Yes, she is. She is her mother's daughter. He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the rain-soaked street below. A black car idled at the corner, its driver waiting for instructions that had not yet been given. Thomas thought about his late wife, Maria, who had died of illness when Clara was only 12. Maria had made him promise to protect their daughter, to shield her from the ugliness of his world while preparing her for its realities. He had kept that promise. Clara knew enough to understand the family business without being directly involved. She knew enough to recognize danger, to read silence, to trust her instincts. But she had also inherited her mother's heart, that stubborn belief that people could change, that love could redeem even the most flawed souls. Daniel Morrison had exploited that belief. He had seen Clara's gentleness and mistaken it for weakness. He had seen her silence and assumed it meant ignorance. He had looked at Thomas Benedetti and seen only a restaurant owner with calloused hands and an accent that slipped through when he was tired. It was, Thomas reflected, a miscalculation that would cost Daniel Morrison everything. "Vincent," Thomas said without turning from the window, "I want complete surveillance on Morrison. Every meeting, every transaction, every conversation. But nothing else. Not yet. When the time comes, I want him to understand exactly what he has done, and I want him to know that it was his own choices that destroyed him." Vincent nodded and rose from his chair. "And Clara?" Thomas finally turned, and for a moment the mask of calm authority slipped, revealing the father underneath. The man who had held his daughter when she cried, who had taught her to ride a bicycle in Prospect Park, who had walked her down the aisle believing he was giving her to someone worthy. Clara will be protected, always, but she must also be allowed to see the truth for herself. When she is ready, she will make her own choice about what happens next. Vincent understood. He had watched Clara grow up, had seen her transform from a shy girl into a composed woman. He had also seen the steel beneath her gentle exterior, the inheritance from both parents that Daniel Morrison had never bothered to notice. The rain continued falling over the city, washing the streets, clean of the day's grime, while secrets accumulated in shadowed rooms. In the penthouse, Clara finally rose from the sofa and walked to the window where her husband had stood moments before. She pressed her palm against the cold glass and watched the lights of Manhattan shimmer through the water. She thought about the woman she had been when she met Daniel at a charity event 4 years ago, young, hopeful, eager to believe that someone could love her for who she was rather than whose daughter she was. Daniel had been charming then, attentive and ambitious, the kind of man who made her feel seen in a world where she had learned to be invisible. But charm fades, attention shifts, and ambition, Clara had learned, was just another word for hunger that was never satisfied. She had tried to make the marriage work. She had adapted to his moods, accommodated his absences, pretended not to notice when he came home smelling of perfume that was not hers. She had told herself that every marriage had difficult seasons, that patience and commitment could bridge any distance, but patience had limits, and commitment required 2 people. Clara pulled her phone from her pocket and looked at the deleted message from her father. He had asked a simple question: "Are you safe?" She had not answered because she was not sure what the truth was anymore. Physically, yes. Emotionally, she was drowning in a marriage that had become a beautifully furnished prison. What Daniel did not know, what he had never bothered to discover, was that Clara had resources of her own. Not just her father's protection, but her own intelligence, her own observations, her own quiet network of loyalty built over years of being underestimated. The household staff reported to her. The doorman trusted her. The accountant who managed Daniel's finances had been carefully chosen by her father years before Daniel ever realized he needed one. Clara knew about Victoria Ashworth. She knew about the hotel meetings, the whispered phone calls, the plans being made without her knowledge but not without her awareness. She knew that Daniel was preparing to leave her, to trade up for a woman whose family name opened doors that Clara's seemingly modest background could not. What Clara had not yet decided was what to do about it. She could confront Daniel and watch him lie to her face. She could call her father and unleash consequences that Daniel could not imagine. She could simply leave, disappear into a new life funded by Resources Daniel did not know existed. But there was another option, one that required patience, timing, and the kind of cold calculation that Clara had inherited from her father, even as she resisted his world. She could wait. She could watch. She could let Daniel Morrison build his house of cards higher and higher until a single breath could bring it all crashing down. And when it fell, she would be standing exactly where she needed to be. The clock on the wall showed midnight when Daniel finally returned to the penthouse. He moved quietly through the darkened living room, expecting to find Clara asleep. Instead, she was sitting in the armchair by the window, a book open in her lap, a single lamp casting warm light across her features. "You are still awake," Daniel said, and there was an edge of irritation in his voice that he did not bother to hide. Clara looked up from her book. "I could not sleep. The rain keeps me awake sometimes." Daniel nodded absently, already scrolling through his phone as he walked toward the bedroom. He did not ask about her evening. He did not notice the slight redness around her eyes that suggested tears had fallen earlier. He did not see the way her fingers tightened on the book's spine as he passed. But Clara saw everything. She saw the faint smudge of lipstick on his collar, hastily wiped but not quite eliminated. She saw the satisfied confidence in his stride, the posture of a man who believed he was winning a game no one else knew he was playing. "Daniel," she said softly, and he paused at the bedroom door. He turned, eyebrows raised in mild impatience. Clara held his gaze for a long moment. "I love you. You know that, right?" Something flickered across Daniel's face. Guilt, perhaps, or simply the discomfort of being confronted with a truth he no longer believed. He forced a smile. "Of course. I love you too. Get some sleep." The bedroom door closed behind him, and Clara exhaled slowly. She had meant what she said. That was the tragedy of it. Despite everything, despite knowing what he was doing, part of her still loved the man she had married. Not the man he had become, but the man she had believed him to be. That love, however, would not stop what was coming. In the brownstone across town, Thomas Benedetti turned off his desk lamp and walked to the window one last time. The rain had finally stopped, and the streets glistened under the amber glow of streetlights. Somewhere in this city, his daughter was making decisions that would shape the rest of her life. And somewhere else, a man named Daniel Morrison was sleeping peacefully, unaware that the ground beneath his feet was about to give way. Thomas thought about the old saying his own father had taught him decades ago in a small village outside Naples. When a man chooses to betray those who protect him, he does not simply make an enemy. He creates his own ending. Daniel Morrison had written his ending the moment he looked at Clara Benedetti and saw nothing worth keeping. He just did not know it yet. Check if you are already subscribed to this channel. If you enjoy stories where justice unfolds in unexpected ways, where the quiet ones reveal their true strength, then you belong here. Subscribe now so you never miss what happens when the truth finally comes to light. 3 weeks passed, and autumn settled over New York like a held breath. The trees in Central Park turned gold and crimson, and the city prepared for the approaching holidays, with window displays and early decorations. But inside the Morrison penthouse, the seasons did not seem to matter. The atmosphere remained frozen in a perpetual winter of polite distance and unspoken truths. Clara had become an expert in observation. She noticed how Daniel's business calls had increased, how his trips to the office extended later into the evenings, how he had started mentioning the Ashworth family in casual conversation as if testing how she would react. The Ashworths are hosting a gala next month, Daniel mentioned one morning over breakfast, his eyes fixed on his tablet screen. For maritime industry executives. I received an invitation. Clara sipped her coffee calmly. That sounds prestigious. Will I be accompanying you? Daniel hesitated just long enough for the answer to be clear before he spoke. It is a professional event. Very formal. I thought it might be tedious for you. I see. Clara set down her cup with careful precision. And Victoria Ashworth will be there, I assume. The question hung in the air between them. Daniel's jaw tightened, but he recovered quickly. Her family is hosting. Of course she will be present. Clara nodded slowly, as if this information were merely interesting rather than devastating. Then you should go. Networking is important for your career. Daniel stared at her for a moment, searching for sarcasm or accusation in her tone. Finding none, he relaxed slightly. Thank you for understanding. This could be significant for the firm. What Daniel did not see was the slight tremor in Clara's hand as she lifted her coffee cup again. What he did not know was that she had already received a detailed report about the Ashworth Gala, including the seating arrangement that placed Daniel beside Victoria at the main table. Her father's network was thorough. That same afternoon, Clara made a rare visit to her father's brownstone in Brooklyn. She had not been there in weeks, preferring to keep her two worlds separate to maintain the fiction that she was simply a Manhattan wife with no connections to anything more complicated. Thomas Benedetti met her at the door himself, which told her everything she needed to know about the gravity of their conversation. The staff had been dismissed. The house was quiet except for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. "Clara," Thomas said, embracing her with the fierce tenderness of a father who would burn cities for his child. "You look tired." She allowed herself to sink into the embrace for just a moment before pulling back. "I have not been sleeping well." Thomas led her to the study, where a fire crackled in the hearth despite the modern heating system. Some rituals, he had always said, were worth preserving. He poured 2 glasses of wine and handed one to his daughter before settling into the leather chair across from her. "I know about Morrison. I know about the woman. I know what he is planning." Clara was not surprised. Her father's knowledge had always extended further than anyone expected. "How long have you known?" "Long enough." Thomas studied her face with the careful attention he had learned from decades of reading people. "The question is not what I know. The question is what you want to do about it." Clara stared into her wineglass, watching the firelight dance in the dark liquid. "I have been asking myself that question for months." "And what answer have you found?" She looked up, and Thomas saw something in his daughter's eyes that made his chest tighten with both pride and concern. The gentle girl he had raised was still there, but something else had emerged alongside her. Something sharper, something that recognized the world for what it was and refused to be crushed by it. "I want him to understand," Clara said quietly. "I want him to know exactly what he threw away. Not because of you, Papa. Not because of your influence or your resources, but because of me. Because I was worth more than he ever realized." Thomas nodded slowly. "That is a worthy goal. But revenge, cara mia, is a meal that must be prepared carefully, or it poisons the one who serves it. I do not want revenge." Clara's voice was steady. "I want justice. I want him to face the consequences of his choices without anyone interfering to make it worse or better. I want the truth to be enough." For a long moment, father and daughter sat in silence, the fire crackling between them. Thomas Benedetti had spent his life in a world where debts were paid in currency most people never wanted to imagine. He had protected his daughter from that world, while preparing her to survive it if necessary. And now, watching her face the betrayal of the man she had loved, he had to trust that his preparation had been enough. "Then, we will let the truth do its work," Thomas said finally. "But understand this, Clara. Morrison is not simply a faithless husband. He is pursuing the Ashworth family because he wants their connections, their legitimacy, their entry into circles where our name means nothing to him. He does not know who you really are, who I am. When he discovers the truth, his reaction will be unpredictable." Clara set down her wineglass and met her father's gaze directly. "Then perhaps it is time he discovered that truth. Not from us, but from the world he is trying to enter." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Explain." Clara leaned forward, and in that moment she looked so much like her mother that Thomas felt his heart contract with grief and love. "The Ashworths have a reputation to protect. They would never ally themselves with a man who married into a family connected to organized crime, regardless of how careful we have been to keep that connection hidden. If Daniel discovers who we are while trying to impress them, he faces an impossible choice. Admit the marriage or hide it. Either way, the truth becomes his problem, not ours. Thomas considered his daughter's words. It was elegant in its simplicity. Rather than acting against Daniel directly, they would simply allow him to stumble over the truth he had ignored for 3 years. The consequences would flow naturally from his own deception. "You have thought this through carefully," Thomas observed. Clara smiled faintly. "I had a good teacher." Across the city, Daniel Morrison sat in a private booth at an upscale restaurant, Victoria Ashworth's hand resting lightly on his arm. She was everything Clara was not. Loud where Clara was quiet, demanding where Clara was patient, ambitious where Clara seemed content with simplicity. At least that was what Daniel believed. He had never bothered to look deeper. "My father is very impressed with your fun's performance," Victoria was saying, her voice carrying the confident cadence of someone accustomed to being listened to. "He thinks you could be valuable in our Mediterranean expansion." Daniel smiled, the expression practiced and polished. "I appreciate his confidence. The shipping industry has always fascinated me. There are inefficiencies in current routes that better logistics could address." Victoria laughed, a bright sound that turned heads at nearby tables. "You sound like my father already. He is always talking about inefficiencies." "Great minds," Daniel said smoothly. He lifted his wineglass in a small toast. "To mutual opportunities." Victoria clinked her glass against his, her blue eyes holding promises that had nothing to do with business. "To opportunities." What neither of them noticed was the man seated alone at the bar, nursing a club soda while watching their reflection in the mirror behind the bottles. Vincent had been doing this work long enough to be invisible, to blend into any environment without drawing attention. He observed the way Daniel leaned toward Victoria, the way their knees touched under the table, the way they looked at each other like conspirators sharing a delicious secret. He noted the time, the location, the details of their interaction. And when they finally left the restaurant together, he followed at a careful distance, documenting everything with the patience of someone who understood that truth, properly assembled, was more powerful than any weapon. The Ashworth townhouse was on the Upper East Side, a limestone facade that radiated old money and older traditions. Daniel did not go inside that night, but he lingered on the sidewalk after Victoria disappeared through the door, looking up at the illuminated windows with an expression of naked ambition. This was his future. He believed. This was what he deserved. He had no idea that his present was already beginning to unravel. The next morning, Clara woke alone in the penthouse. Daniel had not come home at all, sending only a brief text message about staying at the office to work on a presentation. She read the message, deleted it, and went about her day with the calm efficiency of someone who had already accepted what could not be changed. She had lunch with an old friend from college, a woman named Rachel who worked in journalism and had always admired Clara's composure. They sat in a quiet corner of a cafe in the village, catching up on months of missed conversations. "You seem different," Rachel observed, studying Clara over the rim of her coffee cup. "I cannot put my finger on it exactly. More settled, maybe, or more certain." Clara considered the observation. "I have been doing a lot of thinking lately, about what I want, about what I deserve." "That sounds serious." Rachel set down her cup. "Is everything okay with Daniel?" Clara's smile did not reach her eyes. "Marriage is complicated, but I am learning to focus on what I can control rather than what I cannot." Rachel nodded slowly, sensing that there was more beneath the surface, but knowing better than to push. Clara had always been private, even in college. It was one of the things Rachel respected about her. "Well, if you ever need to talk," Rachel said carefully, "I am here. And if you ever need anything else, my resources are at your disposal. Journalism has its advantages." Clara reached across the table and squeezed her friend's hand. "I appreciate that, more than you know." Later that evening, Clara returned to the empty penthouse and stood at the window that had become her favorite thinking spot. The city stretched out below her, millions of lives intersecting and diverging, stories playing out in apartments and offices and subway cars. She thought about Daniel, probably still with Victoria, weaving plans for a future that did not include his current wife. She thought about her father, sitting in his study surrounded by the weight of decades of choices. She thought about herself, standing at a crossroads she had never expected to reach. The girl she had been when she married Daniel would have fought to save the marriage, would have confronted him, pleaded with him, tried to understand what she had done wrong, would have shouldered the blame for his failures because that was what she had been taught love meant. But Clara was not that girl anymore. She was someone who understood that some battles were not worth fighting, that some people would never see the value of what they held until it was gone. That strength was not always loud or dramatic. Sometimes it was simply the quiet refusal to accept less than she deserved. Daniel had made his choice. Now Clara would make hers. And when those choices finally collided, the impact would reshape both their lives forever. The phone in her pocket buzzed with an incoming message. Clara glanced at the screen and saw her father's name, one sentence sent with the weight of years of understanding behind it. The Ashworth investigation is complete. The results are interesting. Clara typed her response without hesitation. Tell me everything. The game was beginning in earnest now, and Daniel Morrison had no idea that he was not the player he imagined himself to be. He was the piece being moved across the board. The Ashworth file arrived at Clara's penthouse. 3 days later, delivered by a courier who asked no questions and left no receipt. Inside the manila envelope were photographs, financial records, and a detailed report that read like a novel of ambition and desperation. The Ashworth family, it turned out, was not as stable as they appeared. Robert Ashworth, Victoria's father, had built his shipping empire through a combination of strategic marriages, aggressive acquisitions, and loans from sources that operated outside traditional banking systems. The family's wealth was real, but their cash flow was strained. Several recent ventures had underperformed, and creditors were beginning to ask uncomfortable questions. Victoria herself was not the simple socialite Daniel believed her to be. She had been engaged twice before, both times to wealthy men, and both engagements had ended when due diligence revealed aspects of her past that the families found unsuitable. There were rumors of gambling debts, whispered stories about money, disappearing from accounts she managed. The Ashworths were not looking for Daniel Morrison because of his talent or his charm. They were looking for him because they needed his fund's capital to stabilize their Mediterranean expansion. They needed a partner naive enough to invest heavily without asking the right questions. And they had identified Daniel, with his hunger for status and his willingness to believe flattery, as the perfect mark. Clara read the report twice, then set it aside and stared at the wall. She had expected to feel vindicated. Instead, she felt something closer to pity. Daniel was not the predator he imagined himself to be. He was prey disguised as a hunter, walking confidently into a trap he could not see. The question was whether to warn him. She considered it seriously, turning the options over in her mind like stones being examined for flaws. If she told Daniel the truth about the Ashworths, he might thank her. He might realize what he had risked and return to their marriage with new appreciation. He might even become the man she had originally believed him to be. But she did not believe that would happen. Daniel's ambition was a hunger that could not be satisfied. Even if he avoided the Ashworth trap, he would find another opportunity to betray her. Another woman who represented a step up in status, another chance to prove that nothing was ever enough. And there was something else. Something Clara had not fully admitted to herself until this moment. She was angry, not the hot, explosive anger that burned itself out quickly. This was cold anger, the kind that settled into bones and hardened into resolve. She was angry at Daniel for seeing nothing in her but a convenient wife. Angry at herself for accepting so little for so long. Angry at the world for teaching women that patience and accommodation were virtues, while teaching men that ambition and acquisition were rights. She would not warn Daniel. She would let him walk into the Ashworth trap with his eyes wide open and his vision completely blind. She would watch him discover too late that the people he was trying to impress had no respect for him at all. And then, when everything collapsed, she would be ready. The Ashworth Gala took place on a Saturday night in early December. The family's estate in the Hamptons had been transformed into a winter wonderland, with ice sculptures in the garden and champagne flowing like water through crystal fountains. The guest list included titans of industry, politicians seeking donations, and social climbers hoping to be noticed. Daniel Morrison arrived in a rented tuxedo that cost more than most people's monthly rent. He moved through the crowd with practiced ease, shaking hands and exchanging pleasantries, always steering conversations toward the Ashworth Mediterranean project and his fund's potential involvement. Victoria found him near the ice sculpture of a ship, her silver gown catching the light from 100 chandeliers. "You came," she said, as if there had been any doubt. "I would not miss it," Daniel replied, his eyes moving over her with appreciation he did not bother to hide. "Your family certainly knows how to host an event?" Victoria smiled, but there was something calculating behind the expression that Daniel did not notice. "My father would like to speak with you. Privately. He has a proposition." The word sent a thrill through Daniel's chest. This was it, the opportunity he had been working toward for months. "I would be honored." Victoria led him through the crowd to a private study on the second floor, where Robert Ashworth waited behind an antique desk. The man was in his 60s, silver-haired and imposing, with the bearing of someone accustomed to having his orders followed. "Mr. Morrison," Robert said, gesturing to the chair across from him. "Please, sit. Victoria tells me you have been quite attentive to our family's interests." Daniel sat, trying to project confidence while his heart raced with anticipation. "The Mediterranean expansion has tremendous potential. I believe my fund could be a significant partner in its success." Robert nodded slowly, studying Daniel with eyes that revealed nothing. "Indeed. We have been looking for the right partner, someone who understands discretion, someone with resources to commit and the flexibility to adapt to changing circumstances. I assure you," Daniel said eagerly, "I can be that partner." Robert exchanged a glance with his daughter that Daniel did not catch. "Then perhaps we should discuss terms. My lawyers have prepared an initial proposal. Victoria will arrange a meeting next week to go over the details." Daniel left the study 20 minutes later with a folder of documents and a head full of dreams. He did not notice the way Robert Ashworth's expression hardened as soon as the door closed. He did not hear Victoria's soft laugh or her father's muttered comment about useful fools. He only saw the future he had imagined, glittering before him like the chandeliers in the ballroom below. But futures, like chandeliers, could shatter. Back in Manhattan, Clara spent the evening at her father's brownstone, watching the gala unfold through photographs transmitted by Vincent's team. She saw Daniel smiling beside Victoria, saw him shaking Robert Ashworth's hand, saw the triumph in his posture as he left the estate, believing he had won. "He has no idea," Clara said quietly, looking at the images spread across her father's desk. "They are going to take everything from him." Thomas nodded, swirling whiskey in his glass. "The Ashworths are desperate. Desperate people are dangerous. They will drain his fund, transfer the assets through a maze of offshore accounts, and leave him holding worthless paper while they restart operations under a different name. I have seen it before." Clara set down the photograph she had been holding. "And there is nothing I can do to stop it, even if I wanted to." Thomas studied his daughter's face carefully. "Do you want to stop it?" Clara was silent for a long moment. Then she shook her head slowly. "No, I do not. He chose this path, Papa. He chose to betray me, to pursue status over loyalty, to see me as an obstacle rather than a partner. Whatever happens to him now is the consequence of his own choices." Thomas reached across the desk and took his daughter's hand. "There is no shame in grief, Cara Mia, even for losses that were inevitable." Clara squeezed her father's hand, and for the first time in months tears spilled down her cheeks. "I am not grieving for Daniel. I am grieving for the woman I used to be, the one who believed that love could transform anyone. That woman is gone now, and I do not know if I will miss her or not." Thomas pulled her into an embrace. holding her the way he had when she was a child frightened by thunderstorms. "You will become whoever you need to be," he murmured against her hair, "and whoever that is, she will be magnificent. Because she is your mother's daughter and mine." They stayed like that for a long time while the fire crackled and the city hummed outside, and somewhere in the Hamptons, Daniel Morrison drove back to Manhattan with a folder full of documents that would destroy him and a heart full of dreams that were already dying. If this moment has touched you, if you feel Clara's pain and her strength in equal measure, then leave a comment right now with the words, "She deserved better." Just those 3 words. Let me know you understand what it means to find dignity in the ruins of betrayal. December dissolved into January, and the new year brought changes that seemed small at first, but would prove seismic. Daniel invested heavily in the Ashworth project, moving funds that represented years of careful accumulation into accounts controlled by people he believed were his partners. He worked longer hours than ever, driven by the vision of the life he was building, the life that would finally match his ambitions. Clara watched from a distance, saying nothing, waiting. She had moved into the guest bedroom of the penthouse, citing insomnia as her excuse. Daniel barely noticed. He was too consumed by his plans, too confident in his trajectory, to pay attention to the subtle shifts in his marriage. The first warning sign came in late January, when one of Daniel's colleagues mentioned casually that the Ashworth fund transfers were not matching the projected timeline. Daniel dismissed it as bureaucratic delay. Red tape, he told himself, nothing more. The second warning came in February when Robert Ashworth stopped returning his calls. Victoria explained that her father was traveling, dealing with European complications. Daniel accepted the explanation because he wanted it to be true. The third warning came in March, and it could not be ignored. Daniel arrived at his office on a Tuesday morning to find federal investigators waiting in the lobby. They had questions about wire transfers, about offshore, accounts about business dealings with entities connected to financial irregularities. The questions were polite but pointed, and by the time they left, Daniel understood that something had gone terribly wrong. He called Victoria immediately. Her number had been disconnected. He called Robert Ashworth's office. The receptionist had never heard of him. He drove to the Ashworth townhouse on the Upper East Side. Different family name on the directory. No record of any Ashworths ever living there. The reality crashed over Daniel like a wave, cold and absolute. He had been deceived, manipulated, used as a conduit for funds that had disappeared into a labyrinth of accounts, while his name was left attached to transactions that investigators were now examining with uncomfortable scrutiny. He was not a victim in any sympathetic sense. He had pursued this opportunity with full knowledge of his own deceptions, with complete willingness to betray his wife for access to wealth that was never as solid as it appeared. But the magnitude of his miscalculation was staggering nonetheless. The investigation took weeks to unfold, during which Daniel's life contracted from penthouses and galas to lawyers' offices and worried phone calls. His fund's investors demanded answers he could not provide. His partners distanced themselves with the speed of people who had always suspected his judgment was flawed. His reputation, so carefully constructed, crumbled like ash in a strong wind. Clara observed, all of this with complicated emotions she could not fully name. There was satisfaction, yes, in watching Daniel face consequences he had earned. But there was also sorrow for the waste of it all, for the marriage that might have been something beautiful if he had ever truly seen her. She began preparations to leave, quietly, methodically, the way she did everything. She packed the possessions that mattered to her, mostly books and photographs from before her marriage. She consulted with lawyers her father had recommended, learning about her rights and options. She made plans that Daniel knew nothing about. One evening in late March, Daniel came home to find Clara sitting in the living room with papers spread across the coffee table. For a moment, he stared at her as if seeing her for the first time, this quiet woman he had dismissed and ignored for years. "What are those?" he asked, his voice hollow. Clara looked up calmly. "Divorce papers. I think you should sign them." Daniel sank into the chair across from her, his face grey with exhaustion and stress. Clara, I know things have been difficult, but this is not the time to make permanent decisions. Once this investigation is resolved— It will not be resolved, Clara interrupted gently. Not in the way you hope. The Ashworths were running a sophisticated operation, and you were chosen specifically because your ambition made you blind. You will be fortunate if you avoid criminal charges. Your fund is gone. Your reputation is destroyed. And I have spent 3 years being invisible in my own marriage, while you plan to leave me for a woman who was using you even more thoroughly than you used me. Daniel stared at her, and Clara saw something shift in his eyes. It was not remorse, not exactly. It was the dawning realization that he had underestimated her, that the quiet wife he had dismissed was capable of insights he had never possessed. You knew, he said slowly. You knew about Victoria, about the investigation. I knew enough. Clara's voice remained steady. I also know things you have never bothered to discover, about my family, about who I really am. What are you talking about? Clara considered how much to reveal. Part of her wanted to tell him everything, to watch his face when he understood the magnitude of his miscalculation. But another part recognized that some secrets were not hers to share, that her father's world was not a weapon to be deployed for personal satisfaction. My father is not simply a restaurant owner, she said finally. He has connections and resources that you never imagined. He has known about your betrayal from the beginning, and he chose to do nothing except let you make your own mistakes, because he understood something you never did. What? Daniel's voice cracked. That I did not need to be avenged. I needed to be free. Clara pushed the divorce papers toward him. Sign these, Daniel. Walk away from this marriage with whatever dignity you have left. Fight me, and you will. Discover that the consequences extend far beyond anything the federal investigators are concerned with. Daniel looked at the papers, then at Clara. He saw her differently now, but the transformation had come too late. The woman before him was not the passive wife he had taken for granted. She was someone who had watched him destroy himself with patience and precision, who had understood the outcome before he had even begun to suspect it. His hand trembled as he picked up the pen. Clara watched him sign each page, watched the marriage officially end with strokes of ink on paper. When he finished, she gathered the documents and stood. I hope you find whatever you are looking for, Daniel. She meant it, surprisingly. Despite everything, she did not wish him ill. She simply wished him gone. Daniel looked up at her, and for one moment there was something genuine in his expression, something that might have been sorrow or regret, or simply the exhaustion of a man who had lost everything he thought he wanted. I never really knew you, he said quietly. No, Clara agreed. You never did. She walked out of the penthouse without looking back, leaving Daniel alone with the wreckage of his ambitions and the echoes of a marriage that had ended long before the papers were signed. Outside, a black car waited at the curb. Vincent stepped out and opened the door for her, his expression carefully neutral. Your father is expecting you, he said simply. Clara nodded and slipped into the car's warm interior. As it pulled away from the building that had been her home for 3 years, she allowed herself one final glance at the illuminated windows of the penthouse. Then she turned her face forward and did not look back again. Thomas Benedetti met his daughter at the door of the brownstone, his arms open wide. She walked into his embrace and let herself be held. Let the tears come freely now that she was safe. It is over, she whispered against his shoulder. Thomas stroked her hair gently. Yes, cara mia. It is over, and now your real life can begin. They went inside together, father and daughter, into the warmth and security of the only home that had ever truly mattered. Outside, the city continued its endless motion, indifferent to the small drama that had just concluded. But for Clara, everything had changed. She was not the same woman who had married Daniel Morrison 4 years ago. She was not the same woman who had sat silently while her husband planned his betrayal. She was someone new, forged in the fire of disappointment, and emerging with strength she had not known she possessed. The future stretched before her, unknown but full of possibility. And for the first time in years, Clara was ready to meet it on her own terms. Spring arrived in New York with the sudden enthusiasm of a city awakening from hibernation. Trees in Central Park burst into green, and the streets filled with people emerging from their winter cocoons. The air carried the smell of blooming, flowers and fresh beginnings. Clara had moved into a brownstone apartment in Brooklyn Heights, not far from her father's home, but entirely her own. The space was modest by the standards of her marriage, but perfect for the life she was building. High ceilings and wooden floors, a window seat overlooking a quiet garden, shelves waiting to be filled with books she would choose herself. She had begun working again, using the business degree she had earned before her marriage and the connections her father's world had never acknowledged. A position at a non-profit organization focused on supporting women transitioning out of difficult circumstances. The work was meaningful in ways that surprised her, allowing her to channel her own experience into helping others. Her father visited weekly. Their relationship deepened by the honesty that had emerged from the crisis. Thomas Benedetti had spent decades keeping his daughter at arm's length from his world, protecting her from knowledge that could have endangered her. Now, with the marriage ended and the truth no longer something to hide, they spoke openly about everything. One evening in late April, Clara sat in her father's study while rain streaked the windows. Vincent had brought tea, an unusual concession to formality that told Clara this conversation would be significant. "I have been thinking," Thomas said, setting down his cup carefully, "about the future, about what happens after I'm gone." Clara felt a chill despite the warm room. "Papa, you are healthy. There is no need." "There is every need," Thomas interrupted gently. "I am 63 years old, and my world is changing. The methods that built my position are becoming liabilities. Law enforcement is more sophisticated. Competitors are more ruthless. And I have seen too many men in my situation hold on too long, only to leave chaos for their families." Clara listened, understanding that this was not a conversation to interrupt with protests or reassurances. "I have been planning a transition," Thomas continued, "gradually shifting our interest toward legitimate operations, real estate, hospitality. The restaurants have always been profitable and clean. They can be the foundation for something new." "That sounds wise," Clara said cautiously. "But what does this have to do with me?" Thomas met his daughter's eyes. "Everything. I have no sons, Clara. No nephews I trust. My lieutenants are loyal, but they are followers, not leaders. When I step away, there will be a vacuum. Someone will fill it, either from within my organization or from outside, unless there is someone capable enough to manage the transition properly." Clara's breath caught. "Papa, you cannot be suggesting—" "I am suggesting nothing," Thomas said quickly. "I am telling you what exists and allowing you to make your own choices. You have proved yourself more capable than I ever gave you credit for. The way you handled Morrison, the patience, the strategy, the emotional intelligence, those are not qualities that can be taught. They are qualities that can only be refined." Clara stood and walked to the window, watching the rain fall on the street below. She had spent her entire life on the edges of her father's world, close enough to understand it, but protected from its demands. The idea of stepping deeper into that world was both terrifying and, she had to admit, exhilarating. "I do not want to hurt people," she said quietly. "I do not want to become someone who makes decisions that destroy lives." "Neither do I," Thomas replied. "That is why I want to change the nature of what we do. But change requires someone to guide it. Someone who understands both worlds. Someone who can earn respect through competence rather than fear." Clara turned back to face her father. "What would this mean practically? What would you need from me?" "Time," Thomas said. "Patience. A willingness to learn the realities behind the restaurant facades, to meet people, understand operations, earn trust through presence rather than authority. Eventually, if you prove capable, you would take over legitimate holdings while trusted associates manage the transition of other interests toward legal enterprise. And if I say no," Thomas smiled, and there was no disappointment in his expression, "then I continue with my current plans, which involve a longer and more complicated transition. You remain my daughter, my greatest joy, and the inheritor of whatever legitimate wealth I have accumulated. Nothing changes. Between us. Clara considered his words for a long moment. The choice felt momentous. A door that once opened could never be fully closed. But she had spent too long being passive, letting life happen to her rather than shaping it herself. The experience with Daniel had awakened something dormant, a recognition that safety was an illusion and that true security came only from capability and agency. "I want to learn," she said finally. "I want to understand what you have built and what it could become. But I make no promises about the future. I will decide as I go, based on what I see and what I feel capable of." Thomas rose and crossed the room to embrace his daughter. "That is all I ask. That is all anyone can ask." The months that followed were an education unlike anything Clara had experienced. She accompanied her father to meetings with legitimate business partners, learning the language of negotiation and the art of reading people. She visited the restaurants, understanding how they functioned both as profitable enterprises and as gathering places where conversations happened that never appeared in any record. She met the people who had worked for her father for decades, men and women whose loyalty had been earned through respect and fair treatment. Vincent took her under his wing, teaching her the practical skills of security and observation. An accountant named Margaret showed her how money moved through complex systems, always staying just within the boundaries of law. Clara discovered that she had abilities she had never recognized, an intuitive grasp of logistics and systems, a capacity for patient diplomacy that diffused tensions before they escalated, a kind of quiet authority that people responded to not because they feared her, but because they trusted her judgment. Her father watched her transformation with pride, tempered by caution. He knew better than anyone the costs of the life he had led, the sacrifices and compromises that accumulated over decades. He did not want that for Clara. But he also recognized that his daughter was finding something in this work that she had never found elsewhere, a sense of purpose and competence that marriage and conventional life had failed to provide. By autumn, Clara had become a familiar presence in her father's world, accepted if not yet fully trusted by the people who mattered. She still maintained her work with the non-profit, finding balance between two lives that were more compatible than they might have seemed. Both involved helping people navigate difficult transitions. Both required patience, empathy, and strategic thinking, and both gave her something she had lacked in her marriage, a sense that she was building something meaningful rather than simply maintaining someone else's vision of success. One evening in October, Clara sat alone in her Brooklyn apartment, reviewing documents for a legitimate acquisition her father was considering. Her phone buzzed with a message from Rachel, her journalist friend, asking about coffee the following week. She replied with confirmation, then set the phone aside and looked around her small, perfect space. A year ago, she had been married to a man who did not see her, living in a penthouse that had never felt like home, waiting for something to change without taking action to change it herself. Now she was divorced, learning the family business, and discovering capabilities she had never imagined. The path forward was uncertain. There would be challenges and decisions she could not predict. But for the first time in her adult life, Clara felt like the author of her own story rather than a character in someone else's narrative. Daniel Morrison had betrayed her for wealth and status, never imagining that his father-in-law was the Mafia boss. That betrayal had cost him everything he thought he wanted, but it had also freed Clara to become someone she might never have discovered otherwise. Sometimes destruction was simply transformation viewed from the wrong angle, and Clara was just beginning to understand how much she was capable of transforming. 2 years had passed since Clara signed the divorce papers in the penthouse she once called home. The city had cycled through seasons, and Clara had changed with it, growing into a woman who bore only surface resemblance to the quiet wife Daniel Morrison had dismissed so easily. The legitimate side of her father's empire had expanded significantly under Clara's guidance. The restaurant chain now included 3 new locations, each profitable and well-regarded. Real estate holdings had grown through careful acquisitions, properties chosen for their potential rather than their flash. A boutique hotel in the Hudson Valley had opened to critical acclaim, combining her father's appreciation for Italian hospitality with modern sensibilities. Thomas Benedetti had stepped back from daily operations, content to advise while his daughter built something that would survive them both. His health remained good, but he had found peace in letting go, in trusting that what he had built would continue in capable hands. Clara visited him every Sunday for dinner, a ritual that had become sacred to both of them. They would sit in the dining room of the brownstone, eating food prepared by the same cook who had been with the family for 30 years, discussing business and family and the small details of lives intertwined for 6 decades. "You have exceeded every expectation," Thomas told her one evening over pasta, "that tasted like childhood memories, even the ones I was too careful to express." Clara smiled, twirling her fork in the way her mother had taught her. "I had good teachers, and good reasons to learn." "Speaking of teachers," Thomas said, his expression becoming more serious, "there is someone I want you to meet, a man named Marco Viotto. He oversees our interests in legitimate shipping and logistics, very capable, very trustworthy, and recently widowed." Clara raised an eyebrow. "Papa, are you attempting to arrange my social life?" Thomas held up his hands in mock surrender. "I am merely introducing my daughter to a colleague. What develops from that introduction is entirely beyond my control." Clara laughed, the sound coming easily in a way it never had during her marriage. She had dated occasionally over the past 2 years, nothing serious, her focus consumed by learning and building. But she was not opposed to the possibility of connection, of finding someone who saw her as she truly was. "I will meet him," she conceded. "Once. No promises beyond that." "Promises are for people who cannot adapt to circumstances," Thomas said with satisfaction. "Benedetti women are far more flexible." The meeting with Marco Viotto took place at one of the new restaurants, a corner table with good lighting and better wine. He was 42, dark-haired and serious-faced, with the bearing of someone accustomed to responsibility. His late wife had been ill for several years before her passing, and grief had etched lines around his eyes that spoke of deeper acquaintance with loss than most people his age possessed. They talked about business at first, the shipping operations he managed, the logistics challenges of legitimate enterprise, the satisfaction of building something sustainable. But as the evening progressed, the conversation drifted toward more personal territory. "Thomas tells me you were married before," Marco said carefully. "To someone who did not appreciate what he had." Clara sipped her wine, considering how much to share. "He wanted things I could not give him, or rather, things he did not know I could give, because he never bothered to ask." Marco nodded slowly. "My wife was ill when we married. I knew what I was choosing, and I chose it anyway. 3 years of difficulty, followed by 2 years of managing her decline. Some people thought I was foolish, staying when I could have left, but I never regretted a moment." Clara felt something shift in her chest, a recognition of kindred experience. "You understood that love is not about convenience. Love is about seeing someone fully," Marco replied. "The weaknesses along with the strengths, the complications along with the simplicity. Your ex-husband wanted someone who fit his vision of success. He never saw you as you actually were." "And who do you see?" Clara asked, surprising herself with the directness. Marco met her gaze steadily. "I see a woman who survived betrayal and emerged stronger. Who is building something meaningful instead of simply maintaining appearances. Who carries her family's weight without being crushed by it. Someone worth knowing better if she would allow it." Clara smiled, and for the first time in years the expression felt unguarded. That might be arranged. Their relationship developed slowly, built on honesty rather than illusion. Marco understood her world because he had been part of it for decades, navigating the complicated boundaries between legitimate business and older traditions. He respected her authority and her capability without feeling threatened by either. And he made her laugh, which was perhaps the most unexpected gift of all. A year after their first meeting, Marco proposed in the garden of the Hudson Valley Hotel Clara had helped design. She said yes without hesitation, recognizing in him the partnership she had always wanted but never found with Daniel. The wedding was small, held at her father's. Brownstone with only family and trusted friends in attendance. Thomas walked his daughter down the aisle for the second time, his eyes bright with tears he would never admit to shedding. The ceremony was brief, the celebration warm, and the future stretched before Clara with possibility rather than constraint. Daniel Morrison did not receive an invitation. Clara had heard occasional news of him over the years, filtered through the channels that kept track of such things. The federal investigation had resulted in civil penalties rather than criminal charges, leaving him bankrupt but free. He had attempted various ventures since, each failing more quickly than the last. The ambition that had driven him remained, but the opportunities to exercise it had disappeared along with his reputation. Clara felt nothing particular when she thought of him. Not anger, not satisfaction, not even the pity she had once allowed herself. He had become irrelevant, a chapter of her life that had ended completely rather than merely closing. On the evening of her wedding, Clara stood at the window of the hotel suite she would share with Marco, looking out at the mountains in the distance. The autumn leaves were changing, gold and crimson spreading across the hills like nature's own celebration. Marco came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. "What are you thinking about?" Clara leaned back against him, feeling the solid warmth of his presence. About how strange life is, how the worst things that happen to us can lead to the best. Your first marriage? Clara nodded. If Daniel had been faithful, if he had valued what we had, I would still be that woman in the penthouse, waiting for something to change without taking action to change it myself. I never would have discovered what I was capable of, never would have become who I needed to be. Marco pressed a kiss to her hair. Then perhaps we owe him a debt of gratitude for being exactly foolish enough to lose you. Clara smiled, turning in his arms to face him. Perhaps. But I think I will skip the thank you note. They laughed together, and outside the window the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. Somewhere in the city, Thomas Benedetti sat in his study surrounded by the evidence of a lifetime's work, content in the knowledge that his legacy was secure. Somewhere else, Daniel Morrison contemplated another failed venture, still unable to understand where his ambitions had gone wrong. And in a hotel suite in the Hudson Valley, Clara began the next chapter of her life, surrounded by love she had earned and strength she had discovered. For wealth and status, he had betrayed his wife, never imagining his father-in-law was the Mafia boss. But the story had never really been about him. It was about her, about Clara, about a woman who refused to be defined by someone else's failures, who transformed betrayal into foundation, who discovered that the quiet ones often carry the greatest power, not because they seek it, but because they are capable of wielding it wisely. The ending was not revenge. It was simply the natural consequence of choices made and character revealed. And it was, Clara reflected, as Marco led her away from the window, exactly the ending she had earned. If you have watched this far, it is because this story spoke to something real in you. Leave a comment saying, "I watched this far, so I can get to know you and see who really enjoys the stories," here on the channel. And if Clara's journey moved you, if you felt her strength and her transformation, then please hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss what comes next. Like this video so it can reach others who need to hear that betrayal does not have to be the end of the story. Share it with someone who might need to remember that the quiet ones often carry more power than anyone imagines. Thank you for being here. Thank you for watching. Thank you for believing that love and justice and strength can coexist in the same heart. Until next time.